I'll deconstruct Utopia in a slightly different way. I've got a lot of slides as usual, but only a few simple points. So I think it is important just deconstructing it. It was actually ambiguous. Utopia was a neologism combined and deliberately, I think, switching between autopia, no place, and utopos, which is essentially making a place better. And it's making the place better, I think, is actually what I think is at the essence of a utopian vision. And what I'm going to question is the idea of, in fact, a singular vision, which leads to this. I think the idea of utopia as being, first of all, isolated. It actually relies very much on an isolated idea, which essentially allows us to reflect back on what is. So it is a proposition, it is a provocation, fundamentally in the way that those utopias have been formulated previously. It is deeply contextual. It's in time and place and the political systems in which it's located. And the memento mori, which of course More was very fond of puns, interplaying with Erasmus I should say, and so the idea of it being a closed and therefore dead. I think the title of my talk is called The Dead End, and I would suggest that the idea of a singular vision for utopia is in fact a dead end, both intellectually but also very literally. It's going to kill this planet. So the seduction of the circle. I find it extraordinary that the middle diagram there, because it is circular, is replicated around the world as being some sort of ideal urban form, as Danilo quite showed a moment ago. Where does this come from? It's a really ridiculous form for a city to be. It closes it, and in fact it assumes that the city is going to continue in that current form forever, which is exactly the opposite to what we need to be doing. If you look at this, of course, it's also really a formulation of what exists when we have unregulated forces of the market at operation. And here you have Burgess's diagram of Chicago in terms of the rings of functions. What Howard was actually on about was the rearrangement of the financial systems and the social systems that went with the Garden City. The physical form of the Garden City was really only of peripheral interest to him. His interest was in the construction and reformulation of economic and social arrangements, which would then perhaps give rise to an ideal urban form. In other words, this is a complete inversion of the way that his diagrams have been used and interpreted over time. So you can see he's very fond of circular diagrams, but no one's going to build a set of cities based on those economic analyses. That's actually the built form that we came out of that, of course, which is incredibly responsive to site and context. Corbusier, he always has to be in these talks, the hand of God being imposed on Paris, devastating the place, given a completely unfair rap. And why do I say that? Because he did not think it was such a good idea to take those towers and turn them into residential apartments. They're in fact office towers. Most of the residents are in fact medium-sized dwellings spread through the city. But more importantly, and where I would criticise the vision, his focus is absolutely on the efficiency of the city. The motivation is what's at question here, not the form. The motivation was seeing the city purely as about efficiency, economic production, and the atomisation of social relations. The fact that people could be reduced to simply needing sun, space, and greenery, which goes to then the much broader set of needs that we've heard from Tony earlier. So this is the atomisation of the individual, the destruction of society, and actually the motivation being entirely about efficiency. This is the Athens Charter, an incredible condensation of, again, unfairly, it talks about preserving historic buildings and so forth. It talks about the public spaces being given primacy over the private, but very much a functional, technocratic view of the city. Pulled apart, and I think a little bit unjustly, by Richard Sennett, but this is, if you like, to prove my point. The obsession with efficiency is really what was driving Serta's plan for Barcelona to accommodate the industrialist visions of what the Catalan nation could be. It did not necessarily have a social program very strongly associated with it. At the same time, you have Hennard's reformulation of the way circulation systems could work, or Harvey Wiley's wonderful separation of all these different transportation systems to make the city more efficient, to make it seamless, to erase any friction between different systems. Isolation. Where would we build our ideal place? Well, 100 miles from everywhere, which is why Canberra is where it is. It has to be at least, seriously, it had to be at least 100 miles away from Sydney and from Melbourne. That's what we had. And the genius of Burley Griffin in understanding how he could actually intervene in that landscape and create a wonderful place centred around a lake, but most importantly, the way that then that place could be inhabited as a vision for a new society. And this is my point. We're seduced by the design of the urban, the genius that's there. But actually, he entered the competition because he saw Canberra as being a leader for the next century in terms of the social and democratic relations that were going to be instilled in it. It's not about the physical design. You can see that as almost the icing on the cake, if you like, which is really not doing him justice. But there it is in his writing. He only entered this competition, the first and last time I will enter a competition, on the basis that he saw this as being a utopian vision, not of the physical form, but of the society into the future. Why? Well, because at that time, across the political spectrum in Australia, there had been a commitment to it being public land, held as leasehold. In other words, this is a social, economic and political framework that had been committed to, which underpinned the entire competition. We get seduced and, I think, distracted by his genius of design. There are the guys that wrote it, they were all men, looking for the site, seriously. This is down to Dalgety. But what happened, of course, was that vision was overwritten by this enormous machine of capitalism and of the idea of cities existing simply to be efficient, which of course you can see here. By the time we get to the real building of Canberra post-Second World War, it had really been overwritten by those same sorts of obsessions of Corbusier and Hennard that we saw a moment ago, obliterating very much the social ethic that had been its original formulation. And you can see it here. The atomisation, the hierarchical arrangements, the very functionalist approach, the technocratic approach with the creation of the NCDC, the National Capital Development Commission. In other words, a very, very, well, as I say, technocratic, an obsession with functionality, let's say. Where are we now? Now, this is a recent document. What I'm interested in my daily life is how do we take some of these visions and how does it play out in the world of business? This is actually a report by Professor Greg Clark, who has a research institute called the Business of Cities. These are a set of reports which I think it's fair to say is probably the most recent encapsulation of what business sees for Australian cities. So this is commissioned by the Property Council of Australia. And in that work, he identifies a series of megatrends. And why I'm showing this, I'm not going to go through all of the words. It's worth looking at. Why? It's worth looking at because even in this business, I think it's fair to say, a business curated, business commissioned by business, that there are these mechanisms which refer to the use of public land, high quality of placemaking, place management and tactical urbanism. So what's actually happening here? There's a recognition, presumably, that has been published, that we need to move beyond functionalism and a technocratic approach. There's an emergence of an acceptance and an understanding that actually there's got to be a bottom-up action and that is essential to produce a good, and for that matter, efficient and productive city. So I think there's a very interesting inversion happening here where if you like, the limits of the system, the limits of the business vision are being recognised by business. Let's put it that way. And you can see over here that there's budgets for neighbourhoods. Now, that's a bit of code, if you like. What that's actually talking about is not designing things in terms of silos and delivering them, but looking at how a place is created as a whole. Right? How do you take government agencies, whether it's housing, health, education or whatever, and rather than being delivered agency by agency through silos, how do all those things come together to actually produce a social context that's actually making a livable and hence more productive city? The end game may still be good for business, but the mechanism by which we achieve that necessarily reconciles social justice and productivity aims. That's what's actually happening at the moment. So then that goes through the filter of the press. So here you have Bernard Salt, and there's his review of that report or series of reports, and I'm just highlighting this one thing. At the very end of this, there's actually a reversion back to what is, to all intents and purposes, a call for a utopian vision, is it not? Because what he's saying is that what we need to do is focus on a common destination and vision. His words, not the report's words. Doesn't that sound a bit like a utopian vision that has buy-in from the entire public? Is such a thing possible? I don't think so. Here's the spread of people who've arrived in Sydney at various time periods. Fantastic mapping by Andy Tice. Here is a mapping of the spread of different ethnicities through the city. Why I'm showing that, is it conceivable or appropriate or sensible to think that that is going to produce a single unified utopian vision for the city? No, it is not. If we now move across to Habitat 3, which has already been referred to. So accompanying Habitat 3, Ricky Burdett, Senate and Saskia Sassens with One Kloss put together what they called the Quito Papers. And it was in fact generated by a critique of the Athens Charter. Now what it shows, amongst other things, is the idea of, if you like, the relationships that might have been possible in smaller geographies completely being blown apart by the fact that we live in a globalised context. So that idea of a singular vision as being a driver that can be simply picked up and replicated, in other words, the modernist universalist model, is really not possible, nor is it appropriate, and nor, as you've just seen, even thought of as being appropriate by business. So the idea of a universal modernism is, well, pretty old hat. So utopia, any utopia, exists in relationship to dystopia, by definition almost. That dystopia, as we've already heard, the planetary limits, that's, if you like, the condition in which any formulation of any utopia by any group on the planet exists in relationship to that dystopian context. Back to the context. Utopian visions exist in relationship to the context in which they're produced. This is our context, as Tony's already pointed out. So in formulating their, if you like, response to, or the remaking of an agenda for urbanity, that's the context in which this document, which I'd commend to everyone to have a look at, that's the context. And part of that analysis of that context is not simply the planetary limits. It is also, and this is the work in that mainly Saskia Sassens' contribution to this, is looking at the big systems, the big financial flows, the property ownership, in other words, the big engine of globalisation, which I think arguably is driving those tensions and stresses that we're putting on the planet, the financialisation of not only property but also food production and so on, means that we're confronting absolutely embedded characteristics of a system here, right? So this is analysis by Glattenfelder. I don't know if you've seen it before. It's not out of that report. But it's an analysis of emergent patterns within complex systems which can tend towards concentration and simplification, concentrations of power and elimination of diversity, actually. So that's the other context. So the context of any utopia is both in relationship to the planetary stresses, but also in relationship to these massive patterns which are inherent in complex systems in terms of their emergent behaviour, and the tendency for those globalised emergent systems to become simple and dominant, and, as we know, actually dysfunctional and dystopian. So I won't go through this in detail, and it's not meant to line up, but in the same way as those mega trends were characterised in the Australian report, you can see the chapter headings and the sort of mega trends in the Keto papers. And similarly here. Now, I pointed out some of those before, but if you look over here, this is now from the Keto papers down below. Planning without democracy, or democracy without planning. Commons can compensate, and I'll come back to that. Integrative networks. In other words, I think you would agree that there's a certain commonality in the view of how systems can work, how urban systems work, and what we need to do at a national scale, which is the ones above, and an international scale, which you see below. Now, in that report also, this is straight out of the Keto papers, this is to do with the commons and to do with bottom-up, if you like, utopianism. But the utopianism is particular, it's localised, and it's highly contextual. It's to do with, yes, the tactical urbanism. It's to do with the creation of local utopias. Local utopias which are actually at threat, under threat, by the forces of globalised finance and the sort of technocratic approaches that we've had in the past, the elimination of difference, if you like. So what they're actually arguing, which I think is absolutely applicable to our condition in Sydney, is the need to code and make space for local utopias, let's put it that way to keep it in the conversation or in the terminology that we're using this morning. So it's not a matter of replicating these particular models, but what it is actually creating the legislative space, the physical space, the space where there will be frictions and supposed inefficiencies in the production of these urban conditions. In other words, it's not simply the model of the unité d'habitation being rolled out across the entire planet. It's about particular models that can actually be given the space to emerge, which may then self-propagate because they also possibly have the potential to be emergent. And this is really the point, because we have to actually continue to provide the conditions for diversity, because the tendency of the big systems is to eliminate that. And that's very much their argument, but it's the argument that I'd put even locally. What am I talking about in a very pragmatic way? And I'm conscious of the howler timer that's telling me that I've run out of time. I'm not sure by how much. I think it's only a couple of minutes, but anyway. What you see up above there is a project just outside Helsinki. It achieves the same density as our beloved Wentworthville just below here. The point about this is that it has multiple land ownership, it has multiple forms of procurement. In other words, the space is being created, and it's not a one-off in Helsinki, but the space is being created for communities to actually determine whether they want to buy off the shelf or whether they want to self-build or whatever. In other words, there's a little utopia there that is over here. I don't know whether you can see it over here. I think it looks pretty utopian. One of the residents, however, has said it's a bit too child-oriented, but still quite okay. You can't beat the Finns for brutal honesty. So when we look at Sydney, where to from here? The vision of the three cities, which is what we've been promoting, is also, I think, a vision for what we do in terms of creating these opportunities for local patterns. We've got a long way to go. We're starting with the blue and green grid, we're starting with a landscape approach, we're starting with an ethos which looks, particularly in the west of the city, at the Aboriginal values that underlie that land. Waianamatta means mother place, which is the western part of the city. And of course, because of that landscape, we've erased it. But the important thing here is to see how we can work with that landscape, drawing from that. That's South Creek. Over here, you probably don't recognise it. That's Sydney Harbour rotated 90 degrees at the same scale with the associated parklands. The challenge for us is, yes, a physical one of how we actually restore and protect that landscape over on the left. We can probably do that. We're really pushing the edges here in terms of how we manage that land and so forth. But the bigger challenge is going to be how we actually set up the systems to, yes, we can respond to the landscape, and that's just meant to be a nice diagram, which I think it is, but it's really, that's the physical design. But if you imagine each one of those places being something like the Helsinki example, we're talking about a very different set of procurement, delivery mechanisms that we need to put in place, not to do it everywhere, but for these different patterns to be allowed to emerge. And so, sorry, I couldn't resist. If we're going to sort of deconstruct Utopia, let's reconstruct it. So Mutopia, and what I mean is let's focus not so much on the form, but let's focus on the process, and the process is one of change and emergence. So I'm going to put that one up there. Who knows? I don't think it's going to last 500 years, but we'll see how we go. The point I'd make, though, is just here on that diagram. I think down the bottom there, that's what we've got at the moment. We have systems which are actually concentrating, simplifying. That's the inherent nature of the big global systems that we have at the moment. What we have to do, the diagram up above there, I don't think this thing works, but you can see, oh, here we go. Yes, we might have a split off here or something, you know, where Google decides or Alphabet decides to divest itself of something that's not so profitable, and you might get that. What we've got to do, though, is actually create the conditions down here to allow things to continue to emerge. We actually have to consciously create the conditions for diversity in a global context. In other words, the vision is Utopia. The vision is that we need millions of utopias, and I'll leave it at that.